having the discussion and learning from all of you. And then Dr. Rodriguez, I guess.
Sure, Jose David Rodriguez. I'm also finishing my dissertation from the University of the West Indies in the area of history. I already had a PhD in systematic theology. And the topic is the Lutheran mission in Puerto Rico from a post-colonial, decolonial perspective. Francisco.
So my name is Francisco Herrera. I am at the very end of my PhD work here at LSTC. I have, gracious, I mean, y'all know me, you know. My dissertation research is going to be on intersectionality and evangelism, because there are too many churches that need to exist that don't exist, and because of that, people die. I just, I really cut to the chase. For me, reforming the church has less to do with making improvements and more to do with the fact that the less that we don't really seriously work to reform existing congregations, this means that there are people who do not hear the love of God, and then the voice of evil in common society just overwhelms them. Not to mention the church as a vehicle for colonization and violence throughout history, especially in our own country. So this is something with which I feel very, very deeply involved. And it is precisely what is the motivating factor behind having this panel to begin with. It certainly is the basis of my relationship with every single one of you, is the work I've done over the course of the last few years. So I'm just very happy to have this chance that we can all come together and be inspired. Jose David, could you do me a favor and just say a prayer over us real quick before we start? I don't think he heard me. Oh, his mic's
still muted.
Yeah. Jose David, can you take off your mute? We can't hear you.
Thank you. Sorry. Dear merciful and loving God, we thank you for the opportunity to gather together for this activity, to share our concerns and our deeply and profound commitment for a gospel that liberates us all from those forces that tend to dehumanize us. We pray that as this activity begins, other similar events will take place, and we pray that those of us who are present here might be able to complete the work we're still working on, so that we can share the very many learnings that we have been able to learn. Guide us, be with us, keep us steadfast in our faith, and move with the power of the Spirit, so that these and other initiatives might be fruitful. In Jesus' name pray. Amen. All right. Should I move on? Well, we are here today to explore what members of this panel has been able to develop in their learnings and in their studies regarding the notion of decolonizing. This will be presented in a variety of ways and perspective. We hope that the opportunity of coming together to share today this perspective might enhance and enrich the way that others might also continue their studies and their ministry. And we also expect to be challenged so that our own perspective might be developed further. I would like then, given the short time that we have, to start with the panelists. And earlier we did share with each other something about ourselves, given the fact that maybe not everyone participating in this activity might know each other. I would ask them to say just a couple of few words and then move into their presentation. And to start, I would like to ask Rebecca to begin this exciting activity.
Thank you, Jose David. And just to clarify, are we just kind of sharing briefly about ourselves first, and then kind of moving into more conversation?
Yes.
Okay. So my name is Rebecca Turnbaugh. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I am in Sacramento, California. I work as the Assistant Director of Outreach at St. John's Lutheran Church there. And it's a pretty big Lutheran congregation. On Sundays, pre-pandemic, probably had about 400 to 500 people worshiping on a Sunday between 3 services in the morning, and pretty robust youth group and Sunday school and all of that. We're in Midtown, and so that means that we engage with people who are unhoused very regularly, and we've had a long-standing sort of ministry in many different ways with that population. And so I'd say that's one of our primary sort of focuses in terms of ministry and in my work in outreach. And yeah, I think I'll leave it. Oh, maybe just one additional thing. I might be using language a little differently here. I got a master's in social justice at Loyola University in Chicago. It's been about 5 years since I've been in graduate school, so I am not in the world of academia. And you know, I didn't do deep dives into decolonization or anything like that, so I might use language a little differently in more of an applied kind of way. But yeah, that's me.
Right.
I'll go ahead and go next. So my name is Francisco Herrera. I'm a PhD student at the Lutheran Seminary here in Chicago. My interest is, my PhD studies are essentially on intersectionality and evangelism, because for me, when we talk about decolonization, and especially in the church, so often I don't hear people talking about the two brass tacks of decolonization: people and land. And so often, since we don't have concrete conversations like that, we don't really get to the heart of the matter of what it means to truly reform the church, let alone make new churches. More deeply than that, I do what I do because there are, one, a lot of very toxic churches that exist, and as a consequence, they just chew up parishioners and pastors. And as someone who has been involved in theological education since 2006 and have seen the direct, immediate impact on so many of my friends. I think it's important for me to put the Spirit's very much called me to work on that. And then also just for parishioners, I do the work that I do because the churches that, there are too many churches that need to exist that don't, for people in the LGBTQ community, for people of color. And because these churches do not exist, people die or people are horribly wounded. And so my call as someone who is both an activist and a scholar is to make sure that these communities exist and to speak with communities that are currently truly intersectional to see what kind of insights they can give to not only the academy and to other existing parishes, but especially for people who themselves feel called to start churches. And so I'm very happy that I get a chance to spend some time talking about this publicly with a lot of people that have been my friends and inspirations for years. And so with that, Pastor Kwame, would you please tell about yourself next?
Thank you. It's a little noisy here in Buffalo, New York, because apparently this is motorcycle season. And so that's what you probably will hear from time to time outside my window. I'm the Reverend Kwame Pitts. I'm an LSCC alum from 2015 with my Master's of Divinity, and currently have finished up my Master's of Sacred Theology from Chicago Theological Seminary. I consider myself to be a practical womanist and also anthropologist in that sense. My concentration is on dual spirituality for peoples of African descent and the African diaspora, particularly concentrated on ritual as a healing catalyst against generational and historical trauma. And I do have a dual spirituality, that is, I practice two different faiths, Christianity and African religions, African traditional religions, which I will get into later. Thank you. Kelly, would you like to go next?
Why, sure. My name is Kelly Sherman Conroy. I am from the Oglala Lakota Nation in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. My Lakota name is Mato Washte Wanyang, which means good bear woman. And I guess I'll just introduce myself in what my dissertation is as well. I am on the final stages of just now getting ready to write my dissertation to be able to present it next year. But for me, as an Oglala Lakota native, my immersion within my Lakota traditions and teachings and my Christian beliefs have been kind of a really essential to my life learning process, right? And so there's this holistic exposure that's been followed by like a Christological duality, right? That it's allowed me to understand and appreciate these practices that come from my Lakota background more in depth, as well as my Christian background, because of the coexistence that I have, kind of what Kwame was talking about, right? Because I've witnessed for myself something more than just a bi-spirituality, especially amongst Lakota Christians like me. One day, kind of like, practicing, we're expected just to practice our Christian rituals or our methods or our routines. And then the next, we can practice our native traditions. And so my work is really vital about bridging together those two paradigms in a way that would honestly otherwise would not have happened. And so it's really grounded in Lakota contextual thought and teachings, and presenting, honestly, Lakota peoples a perspective on kind of fully living into our ancient traditions and our Christian teachings in this kind of holistic framework, right? So it's a way to be able to empower people, especially my Lakota people, to be completely embodied, by the sacredness that surrounds them, right? And it brings healing to the generational trauma that we have carried in our lives. And it just allows us to be able to be renewed as the children of God, the way God intended us to be. So that's just like a very shortened and quick version of what I do. And in the Twin Cities, I answer that in my work. I'm a minister of social justice and advocacy at a church here in the Twin Cities in Northeast Minneapolis. And I do a lot of stuff and recently convened interfaith chaplain movement chaplains. And it's because of the trauma that I experienced from Christians, from missionaries as a child when I lived on the reservation, even actually more recently as well, that I wanted to make sure my friends, like people who wanted to go out and help people or try and help the community in the midst of not only this pandemic, but when the murder of George Floyd happened, right? That we don't send people out who cause more harm and trauma because of their whiteness. Because just because you're good going Christians doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do something, you're going to do help, you could cause more trauma, right? And more pain. So how do I answer that? And how do I teach people? So to see that, but I'm going to quit because we can talk about it more later. And I will choose, who else is there? Who would like to go next? Okay.
Oh, I can go next. Yeah, hello everyone. I am Hesron Sihombing. I'm originally from Indonesia. My pronouns he, him, his. I'm a PhD student, second year at the University of Denver, and I live School of Theology. And I am an alum of LSTC 2019, and I am currently doing my coursework in the program and still haven't decided what I would like to do for my dissertation. I'm still exploring, but what I'm interested in, especially for this panel, what I would like to talk is about how to decolonize our Lutheran or ecumenical understanding of Christology. What are some of the Christological elements that are there in the Lutheran tradition, and how to understand that from the perspective of post-colonial theories, how to localize what happened in Germany and then understand it from the perspective of not universalism or colonization, but from the perspective of local context in different parts of the world. So I'm going to talk about how Christology or Christological elements have been used to justify oppression and to justify colonization and to make people docile, not to be able to resist the oppression and also colonization that happened in different parts of the world. So that would be my talk today. Yeah, I want to pass it to Pace.
Thank you. I am Pace, pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I am a PhD candidate at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. And what I study there and what my dissertation will be on is Martin Luther's Genesis lectures. Martin Luther presented these over a 10-year period, 1535 to 1545, and finished just a year before he died. And for a long time, kind of the Luther scholars did not really accept the Genesis lectures as really being authentic Luther. There are some weird stuff in there because there's no original manuscript in his own hand of his lecture, of this particular lecture series. Basically what's published is compiled from student notes and stuff like that, and also kind of shows some of the hands of the editor. And also Luther's theology is a little bit different than what is considered standard mainline Lutheran theology. And so for a long time, it was thought that there just was not much effort put into Luther's Genesis lectures. But I think that's kind of tied into this whole decolonizing project, because it's late Luther, so of course his theology is going to be different, and kind of the standard now is very different. The Genesis lectures have kind of been renewed. There's some renewed interest in them. And what I'm doing with the Genesis lectures is a queer theological anthropology. So in other words, I'm trying to, Luther talks a lot about body stuff there. He talks a lot about gender. He talks a lot about sex and sexuality in ways that are really, you could almost say forward thinking. But of course, he's still very much a man of his time. So in other ways, very harmful and kind of represents the status quo of the church. So that's kind of my project. And so today I'm going to be talking a little bit of something outside of my wheelhouse. It's still going to be very Luther-centric. It's still going to be very queer, but I'm going to be digging into kind of a distinctly Lutheran eschatology. So this has been fun to work on over the past few weeks and think about.
Okay, I think that's it. Jose David, take it over. You're still muted, Jose David.
Thank you. Now I did. The notion of decolonization is a very interesting notion that it has a lot of important implications, particularly after the Second World War, which is the most recent action about decolonizing, and particularly the organization of the United Nations, because the goal after the Second World War was to try to support the emerging nations and to try to allow them to have a say in terms of the past expression of imperialism and colonization of the lands throughout the world. So it's a notion that is very, in a way, important in the 20th and 21st century, and is being taken as a hermeneutical approach to understanding the different fields of human knowledge. And today, we will have the opportunity to hear some of the panelists use that type of hermeneutics to engage in an examination of topics that traditionally might provide a particular way of understanding, but yet with this new hermeneutical or this particular hermeneutical approach might open up the opportunity to explore dimensions that were not there before. And I'm not going to keep on talking about the decolonizing methodology, but I'm going to ask our panelists to help us understand their particular perspective on this important hermeneutical approach. So to start, I'm going to try to follow the list that I have in front of me, and I'm going to invite Pastor Kwame to begin her presentation. Of course, these presentations are not going to be tremendously long, but we will try to bring them all together, and after that, we will have a period of questions and answers. Pastor Kwame.
Thank you so much. So one of the things that I think about when we're talking about decolonization is really centering around religion for peoples of African descent. The reason why this is important for me in the work that I do is because one of the things that we have found as a people is the factor that Platonized Christianity or Western Christianity has been extremely harmful in our strive for freedom. We have not experienced true liberation in this country. Even though we were temporarily freed out of chattel slavery, it continued in various forms. And so therefore, my ancestors then took upon this new religion as a mode of survival. But what this new religion did for my ancestors was then to strip them of their identity. They were told that they had to assimilate, and this would only be the gateway into maybe perhaps citizenship. But of course, that was a falsity. The other reason why breaking down what it means to be both Christian and other is so very important is because what I have found in my conversations over the past 10 years is that the empowerment that we have for doing racial justice and fighting against systemic racism and oppression has not come from Christianity. The example would be in mainline Protestant Christianity. For many of us who have been in maybe this particular denomination, have been exposed to the fact that we have been told we had to assimilate to what being the proper Lutheran was, which was white, cisgendered, and speaking along socioeconomic and political lines. And so one of the things I think is very important is the fact that there is a different tradition for us to be able to bring us back to what we are supposed to be doing. And it's a way also to break the cycle of pain, suffering, and generational trauma that we still carry in our DNA even to this day. So as Kelly had talked a lot about her people and those traditions, how very important they are, and this balance that I think that she is definitely trying to create and project. Part of my scholarship really is talking about reclaiming who we are. So many of the traditions that I'm talking about are Santeria, Ifa, Voodoo, Haitian Voodoo, Candomblé, Paulo, and others, including conjure and root work. Conjure and root work were very important in the 1900s. A lot of my friends and colleagues who grew up maybe perhaps on the south side of Chicago or in the South talked about dream books that our grandparents used. Things of that nature just to start out with. The reason being of bringing of these particular traditions up front and in the stratosphere instead of it always being behind or being a subtext is because of what we've been told throughout our lives, that these traditions were demonic, that these traditions had no bearing on our lives, and the only way to salvation and to grace was through Jesus Christ. Understanding that Christianity does have a place in North Africa, but if you look at the entire swath of Africa, Christianity is not the be-all, end-all. There are places in Africa where people have basically said, for example, in Ghana, that Christianity has been a detriment. For example, there are people who say they thought that if they went to the Christian priest, that all their problems, all their poverty, all their suffering would end, and that was untrue. Where did they go when that dried up? They went back to the traditions that they knew. For the Haitian Revolution that happened, it was not simply because of the socioeconomic problems and issues that were going on, the pain, the suffering, the violence against their people, the taking of the land, the sort of relearning or the forced learning about how they were to be as a human being, erasing who they were in their culture. Instead of that, instead knowing the fact that Christianity was not the saving grace, what they did is they went back into nature, called down a very powerful spirit, or Loa in Haitian Voodoo, and that is what began the Haitian Revolution. What would that look like today if people of African descent in the diaspora in this country began to draw on Santeria or Voodoo into these fights of liberation and freedom that we're fighting for now? What if we took those particular rituals and traditions that are healing in one aspect, and at the same time, also our protection? I think one of the conceptions that people have about these particular traditions is that, or any other tradition, when we talk about having this sort of dual spiritual life, is that these particular traditions should coincide and coexist with other traditions, i.e. cisgender white traditions. However, I think it needs to be very clear that these particular traditions are all about the protection of our people. They're about our survival. Peoples of African descent in this country are in exile. We do not have a place to go to. We have been erased from all of our tribes, all of our languages, all of our cultures. We have reclaimed and made something brand new in this country. And the last bastion of survival and thriving for us then would be to embrace these traditions as, again, bring them back to our own. These are our traditions. Many of us practice it. They are important. They are not violent. The reason why they are seen as demonic is because they are the catalyst for a brand new revolution for our people here. And I'll stop. Thank you.
Why don't we invite Reverend Hestrom to be next?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Pastor Kwame. That was beautifully said. My work comprises of two things. The first is a critique, and the second is how to reclaim the self-determination of indigenous peoples. The first one, a critique, coming from Lutheran tradition, especially from Asia, I found that the problem with having Lutheran traditions taught in different parts of the world is that those traditions are taught as a universal value, universal belief that everyone should confess the same. And if we look at, for example, the ecumenical creeds, the writings of Martin Luther, right? The Augsburg Confession, and other Lutheran resources, we can find, especially earlier resources, we can find that all these, all the languages and also all the Christological elements that are there talk about Jesus as the sacrifice, Jesus as the one that gives us the forgiveness of sins. And the understanding of Jesus is always a matter of whether Jesus has two substances, that Jesus is both God and human. This understanding is made universal. And if we look at different cultures, this understanding doesn't make sense, and it doesn't answer to what the people are really struggling with, right? So is it possible to talk about the colonial Christology while also universalizing these Christological elements while they are not relevant to the life of the people, right? While they are not answering the struggle and the context in which people live? The second thing is how to reclaim the self-determination of indigenous peoples, of local people, in understanding their faith. So for me, a decolonial Lutheran Christology should draw its Christological elements from the particular context it emerges. It needs to struggle with the context it lives. It needs to configure differences, hybridity, and plurality as necessary factors for a dynamic and organic Christology. And to reclaim and to regain this self-determination could mean that people look at their own culture, people look at their particular context and struggle, and see Christ present there, and relate to Christ in ways that are answering to their own particular struggles. So not to say that the colonial Christology should always engage with culture and also essentialize the culture and romanticize them, but also to look at the culture in a critical way, because there are elements that have colonial attitude in the pre-colonial and post-colonial context of the culture. So how do we deal with both things, this criticism, and at the same time, how to reclaim the self-determination of local people in understanding Christological elements, so that Christology could mean other than the forgiveness of sins, which could be liberation, transformation, and also peace and harmony with the earth, the Mother Earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Hedstrom. Rebecca.
Thank you. So I feel first have to say that like writing this article and getting ready for this conversation really did a number on me. I was working through it, and I eventually had to kind of pause and say, I need to stop just trying to sound smart and instead sound loving. And so I took a different tactic. I tried to tackle the idea of salvation, and also the idea of how white supremacy has become wrapped up in our theology around salvation, and specifically, I mean, just one element of white supremacy, which is individualism, which obscures the ways in which we systemically or systematically oppress people by blaming people for their individual failings or asking for individual responsibility, and sort of have this social contract of I'll take care of me, you take care of you, and if you have like if you're not doing okay, it's probably your fault and nothing else. And so I was looking at some writing by George Tinker, who is a citizen of the Osage Nation and also a Lutheran pastor, and his ideas around salvation, which is much more oriented toward community and the entire earth, which is something that in my context and that I've been raised in and now work in, I think we can really do some learning around how we live in community with one another and with our neighbors and with the earth. So a little bit about my context in Sacramento. It's a predominantly white church, not exclusively, but predominantly, and a fairly economically comfortable congregation. And I think those two identities can often stand in the way of us understanding really how to be in relationship with other people, which in my view really starts with just listening and honoring, listening to and honoring like the stories of others. So the things that really influence me in my thinking is sort of the conversations that I have with people, both within our church and in ministry out in the community that I'm doing. And I do a lot of work with people who are unhoused, and I have grown in my own sort of understanding and in my own personhood by being involved with this population in our community, and went to try to organize with some of our folks around how can we be more in relationship with this community, not just in a transactional kind of charitable type of way, which is a lot of what our ministry is. It's serving meals or Before COVID, we would do overnight events, that sort of thing. And how can we be working together for a more just solution in the community? And I wanted to start with just having conversations with people, one-on-ones, right? And people were so resistant. And I asked a few people point blank, is the reason why you don't want to have conversations with people who are unhoused because you feel like if they had something valuable to say about their own experience, then they wouldn't be in the situation that they're in? And they said yes. And it was really discouraging because it is, again, sort of like blaming an individual for everything that is happening in their world and not being able to see larger structural forces at work. And I asked those people, do you want to think that? Do you want to be in that place? And they said no. And so I encouraged them to try it out and see how it went. And then they kind of came back to me and said, I can't do it. And so there's this huge barrier that I encounter all of the time. And not just around homelessness. We do have a growing racial justice ministry that we're still learning. I put myself in this category. I'm still learning all of the ways in which we don't honor one another, all of the ways in which we think we're offering a genuine welcome and we're not. And so this is sort of like real-time learning as I was writing this. And so, yeah, I also incorporated into this article moments of just sort of pause for white audience reading it, to take some breaths, to recognize what's going on in their minds and in their bodies, because I know from experience within my own self and in people that I've been in conversation with and pressing them to be uncomfortable with new ideas, that there is a huge, very quick defense shield that goes up. Listening to new and difficult ideas is not something that we do very well. And so I have to care for that. And not in a way that says, oh, I'm sorry, I made you uncomfortable, but saying okay, this is going to be uncomfortable. We can do this, but I need you to kind of recognize this and move through it. And so, me being in the context that I am, have to learn ways of trying to diffuse that so that we can then engage in the really meaningful work that is before us. I think I'll probably stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm going to invite now Pace Warfield.
Well, thank you for the invitation. So, like I said earlier, I am looking at eschatology, which is, I think, in mainline Protestantism, probably one of the more underdeveloped aspects of theology. And there are a few things I want to say here. First, traditional notions of eschatology are very dualistic, and so they look very much like the headcanon of Aristotle and Plato. And that's not at all what I think is true to what the Bible says or representative of Luther. So it's kind of this earth destroyed, new heaven, new earth. Our bodies are destroyed and given new angelic bodies, or perhaps there's no body at all, but souls just fly around heaven like lost puppies or something, I guess. I'm not exactly sure what people have in mind, at least on a cultural level, what they think of when they think of a Christian view of heaven or the world to come, or eschatology. Is it going to be like the Left Behind series? Who knows? And so for me, I wanted to start with where I'm at. I am fat and trans. I am very invested in body. And so this notion of this dualistic future where there's some sort of superior superiority of the soul over the body does not cut it for me. And also, I just want to say, if the Gospel of Luke is to be believed, I would say that most of you are going to have body sizes more similar to mine than you will to Brad Pitt in heaven, because there's so much feasting and food and good stuff there. So it's like, so that's kind of the starting place for me. Also, of course, with being a Luther scholar, I can't help but wonder what Luther would say about this. Luther is very much not dualistic. Which is so surprising given the late medieval, early modern period that he was writing in. Excuse me. So, and then the last thing I kind of am thinking that's kind of mixed in with all this is the kind of, what does science have to say about the future of the universe, about the future of our planet? We have reliable means to study and predict what's going to happen in the future. So why should theology be ignoring those? One thing that stands out to me is this hypothesis called the deep rip hypothesis for how the universe can end. Kind of the one that most scientists support is the big freeze. So basically, as space continues to expand, the stars will start to go out eventually, and there won't be much heat or energy in the universe. Eventually the background radiation will fade and dissipate, and so basically we'll have this frozen universe. But the deep rip hypothesis takes it a little bit further and suggests that because of dark matter, the universe is going to continue to expand at an increasingly accelerating rate, to the point that molecular bonds and cohesion will be lost, and everything in the universe will fade into eternity. So this is kind of all the stuff going on in my head. Very disparate, I get, but it goes somewhere. So bear with me. So the status quo of Luther studies is very white, cis male, straight, dominated by historians. My entire life doing Luther studies, working with Luther, tends to get written off as being anachronistic. You can't talk about Luther and LGBTQ issues because Luther had no concept of contemporary sexuality and all this kind of bullcrap. And it's just not, that's not helpful. And that also, I think, is very kind of this colonial mindset, this very narrow view of how we can talk about theology, how we can talk about theologians. Yes, we need to seat them in their historical context. But if we believe that their words have value for us today, then there has to be some ability to relate to that and to make those connections. And that kind of flies in the face of a lot of the status quo of Luther's scholarship. And then also I want to say that Marcella Althaus Reid is kind of the foundation for my own queer decolonizing work, especially her book Indecent Theology. If you know anything about queer theology or queer theory, it very much has its origin in Michel Foucault, kind of shown through Judith Butler and stuff like that, this very theoretical origin to queer scholarship and queer theory. But what Marcella Althaus Reid does is she basically she begins her book Indecent Theology by talking about these lemon vendors in Buenos Aires and how their lived experience is already queering the narrative framework of colonization, just by them being alive, by them not following convention, whether or not it's intentional or not, just by them living their daily lives is already doing the work of queering. And so that's also kind of part of that puzzle. So basically where this all comes together is with Tuomo Mannerma. He is a Finnish scholar who did some ecumenical work with Luther and the Greek Orthodox Church in Finland. And he kind of uncovered in Luther that Luther very much believed in theosis or divinization, which is essentially that the goal of a Christian, or the kind of eschatological potentiality of Christianity, is union with God. And so to me, as a fat, queer, trans person, that sounds really sexy, right? That sounds like, what else is union beyond this kind of, Luther calls it the happy exchange, or the happy marriage between Jesus Christ's attributes that Jesus gives to us and us. So there's already this kind of sexual imagery there. So for me, eschatology is basically some sort of heavenly orgy, banquet, something along those lines. And it's something that brings us into full union with God, full union with each other, in a way that is not at all vanilla, but is kind of that kinky, queer, theological eschatology that Marcel Althaus-Reid gets at. And for Luther, I mean, for me, like I said, Luther does not at all have this body-mind dualism or body-soul dualism. And so to me, it's very important that we keep bodies in some form in our view of the future. And what will that look like? What is this new body, this new heaven, this new earth going to look like? And so I think there is, of course, the God's love for us does take an erotic angle, and eros, of course, that deep desire we all have for each other. I'm not talking necessarily exclusively about sexual desire. Eros, of course, is much more expansive than that. And so how that kind of all comes to play for me is this kind of eschatological becoming one with another, within the triune God, within that indwelling that the God does within God's self, and we with God, in communion with God. And so that's kind of a very long, meandering way of getting to my point, but hopefully that made sense to you all.
Thank you, Pace. Let's invite Kelly.
Thank you for the invite to speak. Well, as earlier, I talked about, a lot of my work is based on my Lakota traditions and Christian traditions, and this, you've been hearing some of us talk about maybe a bi-spirituality, or and that, but I think one of the important parts about my work, and especially when it comes to addressing especially Lutheran theology and a Lakota thought in this, is addressing, before I address those healing traditions, those teachings, that it's important to focus also for me in the decolonizing part of this, is the need to make amends by naming the trauma that's been inflicted on Native people over the centuries, right? Because I think naming the trauma is an essential step that it precedes healing from that trauma, right? So that Native peoples, we were forced off our lands. We were sent away into exile, right? We were forced to go on death marches. We were cheated by the federal government. We were lied to by our allies. And the one punishment that Native people feared the most for any egregious misdoing was not death by execution, but it was exile. Because the Native spiritual perspective, the interrelatedness of all things, the kinship of humanity, each person's sacredness as a vital part of the whole, it was all grounded at the center of the Native experience of life. In Lakota perspective or thought, we call that the Lakota Wichoa, right? And it's within the traditional Lakota identity that the foundation of community is the understanding of this sacred interconnectedness. So where there was this understanding that the values that we, not the I, within the community, right? Losing the we only became an I, and that was worse than death, right? And losing, and it meant becoming non-human. Dr. Stephen Charleston talks about this. It meant becoming non-human because of the traumatic loss of sacred community values, right? It was this isolation from community, and it was to be kind of consigned to this internal limbo from which there really was no escape. And so Native peoples at that time of this colonial conquest, right? They couldn't change what the colonists or the missionaries or the governments thought about them. And they eventually began to believe what these oppressive systems were telling them, right? That the trauma inflicted began to perpetrate the mentality of all the Native people. And it began this kind of internalized cultural genocide. This process, to the extent that Native peoples didn't know how to exist within communities because they were forced to assimilate, right? So a lot of my work is naming that. It's a hard thing, but then it's moving on from that, because we have some amazing Native theologians, just like Rebecca mentioned earlier, Dr. Tinker. We have Vine Deloria, Dr. Charleston, and Dr. Woodley. There's many of them right now, right, that have done some great work before this. And how do we move on from that naming and that healing and reclaiming? And part of my work that I've realized is there's been a struggle, because in the academic world, right, research was used as a means of destroying the Native people. It was the means of cultural genocide, right? It was a critical tool of colonization, which this idea that Indigenous story kind of taking, right, and a story making, it was this vital part of this colonial kind of westernized research on people, and it was used to define, and it destroyed, and it deterred the valuing of Native people and their knowledge and their practices. This idea of research in the Western Academy was used to further cause more trauma. And I'm finding that in my work right now is this line between this balance that I see the amazing Native theologians before me had to carry as well, and those of us who are writing in this is there's this balance we have to carry of trying to be our full authentic self, right? And then there's this being stuck in this westernized thought and process of research and academy that we are so used to following. And it is a really hard balance, right? And so how do we, a lot of my work has been, how do I navigate through that? How do I create a healing process for Native people, for like me, right? And I think in order for my work, in order to for like a Lakota kind of theology of sorts, a Lakota gospel narrative, is to thrive. It has to happen within that context of community and understanding the story, right? And reclaiming that story. And but there needs to be that new language. There needs to be a language of community, or recapturing of that ancient language that came with like my Lakota people, with Native people, right? Because we carried a language of community, we carried a language of story. And the language of this kind of Western imperialism, it manifested within a lot of the theologies that we in seminary today are learning. And it's hard to see that, right? But there's hope, I think, for a truly Lakota kind of gospel narrative, right? It lies in placing the gospel story as the first thing, right? This allows this theory, this story to not only shape the gospel story, but it's shaped by the gospel story through a Lakota lens, through a Lakota view of things, right? And it's kind of bringing back the gospel story to the hands of the Native people, right? And that's I'm not saying like that Lakota, that a Lakota gospel or a new gospel narrative is going to change the gospel per se, right? But the priority of the gospel story from which one kind of derives that Lakota gospel narrative that I'm working on is in keeping with identity and oral tradition among my Native people, right? It's in order, I need to do those things in order to find an authentic kind of Christian gospel narrative that is larger than where we are, that is, we're able to hear the truth, hear ourselves in the story, not trying to place what we believe, who we are, our traditions, and try and find a place to fit it into the story, but to be able to hear our story and understand we are that story, right? And that's been one of the biggest struggles for me in my work is taking those narratives or creating that narrative, because we are so used to trying to force ourselves into the story as Native people. There's a lot of trauma that is based onto that, right? And earlier I said the Lakota Wichon, it means the Lakota way of life, right? It's a very spiritually intense and intentionally lived life experience, right? So a Lakota person is taught to like live life spiritually, and then that turns into this daily life that is like living worship, right? So in a Lakota thought and philosophy, there's this very holistic nature that allows for a community to strengthen through relationship with each other and with themselves, and it's through the self-discernment of life and past and present and future in order to find these answers. And I think that's where Lutheran theology is also really relational, because the theology creates an understanding of trust in response to God's love, right? That Jesus has modeled this idea of relationship discernment for us already, that never entirely giving us the complete answer. It was God's way to the individuals to seek the solution to understand their relationship with God. There and then opens this kind of decolonial idea of how we tell the story and how we can bring back the story where the people understood, right? That the Native people, they understood, right? And so my dissertation is a lot in my work, and what I'm going to write for you all is kind of to demonstrate that, right? That even looking at Luther, he made that, the theology of the cross that shows God presented, it was present in the crucified Jesus, that creating this Lakota gospel narrative that I'm working on, it speaks authentically of that cross, of those generations of Native people they had to carry, right? And it shows further that not only did that cross include pain, but a cross whose love is so great that through these generations, the strength, the healing were all so constant. It was a deep foundation, right? It's modeling this idea of this Lakota gospel that I'm working on, this narrative that this cross is powerful enough for the Lakota people to finally be able to really boldly claim fully, like our whole authentic selves as children of God. And I think that's like the coolest thing ever, because I have always been told I can either be one or the other, right? That I can neither be both. But this process in looking at theology in this way and creating a narrative that is inclusive for Native people, it's a spiritual act of living worship through our daily actions. And I used to hear a lot that that I couldn't be one or the other, right? But the more I research, the more the more I read the Bible, the more I take these classes. Nowhere in the Bible does it say to be a Christian that we have to be defined solely by these European cultural identity markers, right? Lakota thought and philosophy, the teachings and the gospel text, they project this new horizon. And we have to learn to be able to see that when we are reading the Bible. Take yourselves out of that colonized way of seeing things. When we read, open your eyes to kind of this new way of learning, just in order to be able to interact, right? Because these things interact together and they become a new understanding of who we are. For me as a Native Christian, but this thought and this process can also help you in when you approach your studies, or when you are approaching trying to find a new way to reach people or to understand people, is to let people be authentically fully who they are. And then by that, it brings up this whole new aspect, this whole new vision of the Bible, of the gospel that God intended us. So I am going to leave that there because I could probably keep going. And I'm not sure who's next.
Thank you, Kelly. And last but not least, let's invite Francisco Herrera.
You're on mute, Francisco.
I want to point out a couple of major themes that I specifically has to do with decolonization. So when I talk about what it means to be empire in the most understandable way, it's that it is an organization or an institution which takes people and things, which include land, and labels them and cuts them up in order to be used for money and power. And that, for me, is the basic, most easily communicable way to understand empire. How this works, obviously, in history, right? So you had, let's look at the Bible, right? Let's look at the Assyrian Empire. Let's not even talk about the Babylonians. Let's look at the Assyrian Empire. So they went in and they conquered northern Israel. And then they took the people off of their land, sent them to other parts of their empire, and then brought other people into the land. This is how the Samaritans got there, for the sake of running the land for the Assyrian Empire, but taking the people who actually lived on that land off, being the Jewish people. And they did that so it would be easier to control the land and control the people, so they could make money and have power. In the most basic way of understanding this. You take something that's beautiful and created of God, that has no labels, that has no borders, that has no boundaries, that exists naturally in this beautiful state, but then empire comes, cuts it into little pieces to be bought and sold, whether it's people or things. And how this then plays in specifically with Lutheranism and in this country. So many Lutherans, when they came to the United States, a fair number of them didn't want to get involved with slavery. In fact, German Lutherans that moved to Texas were so virulent in their, or so powerful in their opposition to slavery, they single-handedly kept Texas from becoming a slave state. Now, the German Lutherans in South Carolina were very different, though. They started off not wanting to have slaves because it was wrong, but they quickly changed. And then it became pretty much the head of the slave trade in the United States back in the 18th and 19th centuries. So there are people there, even within Lutheran history, that started off not wanting to be involved in turning people and things, cut them up to be bought and sold, but eventually they bought into it. But in some respects, we even see that, and that's what I'm writing about mostly with my article, because what does this then have to do with, one, as Pastor Kwame mentioned earlier, creating people who are in exile. So people will go to their own churches, but because of their sexuality, because of their gender, because of their race or ethnicity, they are in exile within their own congregations. Or people, similarly, that are taught to assimilate in their own congregations. I focus a lot on the congregational level. And in some respects, even the ELCA itself as an institutional body is, because you had all of these different synods or denominational groups starting in the 19th century that wanted to become essentially a corporation, right? So there's now the business element, right? Now, there were, I think, some good intentions there because they wanted to be able to share resources and to try to, become more like a church. But it was still a community that was trying to figure out how to turn people and things into things that could be bought and sold for the sake of having power. And as the church continued to grow and develop, all of these people who have been treated horribly by the institution start leaving or speaking of their experiences of pain or how the church has traumatized them, or just break off wholesale. So talking about decolonization, specifically within the ELCA, let alone the church in the US, is a pretty powerful tool. But even more specifically, how this decolonization fits to Lutheranism, I actually really like going to the creeds, or to actually part Augsburg Confession. I don't know how many of you have a book of Concord handy. I usually do. But I think it's important, if we're talking about decolonizing Lutheranism, then let's actually go to the documents itself, right? So if you get the Augsburg Confession and you take a good look at it, if you really look closely, there are usually a couple of narratives you have to keep in mind. The first is that this is a document that is produced by people who are fighting against the Holy Roman Empire and fighting against the Vatican, which is true, right? So in some respects, it's kind of an anti-colonial document. But at the same token, they are trying to also establish themselves as another government, or sort of, an empire of sorts, but based in Saxony, and certainly is another religious empire or authority. And one of the ways that you do that is by writing documents. So the where I like to kind of look at is, so there's this really great book called Narratives and the Arts of Resistance, or Narratives of Resistance, by this is Jose David introduced me to this, and he's a sociological anthropologist, and he talks about public transcripts and hidden transcripts. Well, public transcripts are the nice heroic stories we tell ourselves that basically show ourselves as the hero and about how good we are and how we're fighting the good fight. But then there are hidden transcripts, and the hidden transcripts are the fuller picture, and usually the stories of the people who are actually being abused by this wonderful, beautiful narrative that's heroic and powerful and wonderful, and how these people aren't really quite so good. And I normally tell people that if you want to figure out how to do decolonial ministry in your congregations, you figure out what the public transcripts are and the hidden transcripts are, and then you bring them together, and that cross then is your ministry. Talk about this specifically in the Augsburg Confession. If you start reading it, everything seems basic. You're talking to church authority and all of that. But eventually, when you get to Article 5 concerning the ministry, you start to hear towards the end, you read passages like this. Condemned are the Anabaptists and others who teach what we obtain, the Holy Spirit, without the external word of the gospel, through our own preparation, thoughts, and works. So that's the second part of the article. The first part's pretty straightforward. To obtain such faith, God instructed the office of preaching, giving the gospel, the sacraments, and through these, as through means, he gives the Holy Spirit, who produces faith, where and when he wills, in those who hear the gospel. So the first part of this is the public transcript, basically saying that we also believe this classical historical thing with the church, that the Holy Spirit is active in faith and gives us the things to preach. Oh, and by the way, damn those Anabaptists. And because, let's face it, if you're worried about violence and abuse from a colonial authority or an abusive person, right, you eventually want to deflect. Yeah, maybe I'm different, but I'm not as bad as these people. And the Augsburg Confession, as a consequence of those simple lines, regular condemnation of the Anabaptists, inscribes forever the persecution of the Anabaptist community in Europe, which, if any of you have friends who are Anabaptists, they are very, very leery of Lutherans because, along with the Reformed communities and the Roman Catholics, Luther wrote a great deal against them, and his writings were frequently used to cause problems for them and to justify persecution. So, as a consequence, it's really important for us, if we're going to talk about really doing decolonizing ministry, certainly decolonizing Lutheranism, we need to look at our communities and see, and look at our ministries and see, what are the public transcripts? What are the hidden transcripts? And how can we bring them together to form a cross that then is the nature of our ministry? The ministries that are not only, that address things like trauma and that acknowledge the fault of the church, but also can be a real place for the presence of Christ and for the healing power of the Gospels.
Thank you, Francisco. Now we are going to invite those who have joined us in this event to see if they can if they have questions for the panelists, or they have comments that they would like to make regarding the impact of the work of these colleagues of ours. And in the meantime, while I'm waiting for some of the questions to appear, I'd like to make the statement that it's very interesting that what we have here is probably a second or third generation of Lutherans who are moving forward with the sense that while Lutheranism has something important to provide in our understanding of the gospel and the Christian teachings, there is an important role in developing a critical understanding of this tradition as we move them forward. We have to thank earlier generations like Kelly and and Rebecca mentioned people like Vine Deloria Jr., Tinker, Steve Charleston, Gordon Strahan, a lot of more, not only scholars, but pastors who have, in doing their ministry, developed an interesting sense of looking back at our tradition and find in the tradition not only things that we can celebrate, but elements that need to be rethought. And I like to celebrate that this new generation is taking the baton and moving forward this conversation with the new tools that we have been able to see developed in our time to continue this important work of witnessing to our faith, but in a way that can expand the horizons, not only of those who anticipated us, but also our own. And that's why a panel like this helps us all to look at what we're doing from a different perspective and continue to move forward in our effort to witness to our faith. Let's see. I don't
have any questions yet, which is unusual because we have a fair number of people here.
Yeah.
I guess I completely lost everybody.
More than 30.
We've got one question in there for Francisco.
Oh, okay. So the question is, are there more recent history examples of the intersection of hidden and public transcripts where healing Christ has happened and where a decolonization is happening? To be honest, yes, there are always examples of this. We don't really hear about them. For me, though, where I could say for sure they happen is wherever you have a community that is seriously addressing lament. If you have either a church or an institution or a family or anywhere that people who have had their voices silenced and consistently downgraded, where you have ministries who have been defunded, a place where liberation can happen is where there's open lament and even anger. A story that I point to regularly, you all see my altar back here, is one of the people on it's very crucial. He's a big impact on me, and especially Kelly Sherman Conroy, is Reverend Dr. Gordon Straw. And Reverend Dr. Gordon Straw used to be in charge of ministries to Native Americans and Alaskan Natives for the ELCA. And when he was in charge of that in the early 2000s, at one point, there was a massive budget cut to all of the ethnic specific ministries, which happens constantly. You know, it wasn't just then, it's now too. And so there was an opportunity for the presiding bishop to sit down with the heads of the ethnic specific ministries to have essentially an open session to discuss how they were feeling and whatnot. And they had a little bit of trepidation. And Gordon went in and ripped Mark Hansen a new butthole, flat out. How dare you do this to us? You are destroying our communities. We are doing such good ministry. The same kinds of things that the white people have done to my people are what you are doing to all of us here. And he really went at him. And that's a moment of decolonization right there, because he told the head of the ELCA directly and unambiguously the damage that his decision had done to their communities. Did it change anything for them? Not particularly. They still lost their money. But there was a powerful moment that allowed for Dr. Straw to provide cover and healing for other people in the community, but for whatever reason, didn't feel comfortable speaking, as well as to remind the presiding bishop that what he did was wrong. So stories of that I see here on a general level of decolonization, that tends to be when they happen. I've seen them certainly in institutions. I've seen them in individual congregations. And that's sort of where I would go. As to how they've been written in books, I'm certain they're out there. There are lots of examples of that that you find in miscellaneous capacities. But that's usually where I would look for, is where can the people who have been treated horribly actually speak openly about their treatment? And that's a really good first step.
I see that there is a very interesting question placed. When and where can we have access to these articles? And if you look at the chat, some of the panelists have been responding, but Francisco, can you say something else about that? Where to find?
Yeah. Rebecca talked about this earlier, the wonderful article called Decolonizing the Language of Lutheran Theology by Tink Tinker. I can't remember his first name. He's a professor at Iowa School of Theology. He's retired. That's a really good place to begin. That article is amazing. Decolonizing the Language of Lutheran Theology. The books that I was referring to earlier, the first one is called Narratives of Resistance, which is kind of the basis for David Scott's research. And then there was another book that he wrote, which is crucial for me, called Hidden Transcripts and the Arts of Resistance. And these two books, if somebody could type that in the chat, so Narratives of Resistance is the first one. Thank you. And Hidden Transcripts and the Arts of Resistance. These books actually give a pretty good practical perspective of what it means to actually do decolonizing work in your community. Honestly, another thing I tell pastors all the time, or even seminary presidents, what is the thing that if you do, especially pastors, what is the thing in the ministry that you will do that if you do it, will split your church? That the Spirit's calling you to do this, to make this hard decision, to say this hard thing, but you're afraid to do it because you're afraid to split your church and lose your job. That is decolonizing ministry. I don't want to hear any excuses like you can navigate it. I know it's going to be hard, but do it, because you will either see if your community is capable of changing, see if it's not, and you can make your decisions accordingly. But most importantly, when you make confrontations like that, the Holy Spirit themselves will come to you and aid you in your ministry and lift up leaders, right? So it could be a chance to actually activate the natural leaders that exist in your church among the laity. And that's what we want, right? So I obviously I do this a lot.
I have another question, and we're reaching the time for the closing, but I like to read it to see whether any of the panelists would like to begin to answer it. It comes from Joseph Ramello. Can Christianity continue to grow if its participants are free to maintain a relationship with Jesus while embracing the very ancestral and indigenous traditions it sought to oust? As a Filipino, I consider myself bispiritual and also a liberation theologian. I have a relationship with my indigenous traditions, but I don't necessarily want to oust Christianity, even though they did it to us. Anyone from the panel want to make some comments?
Kwame, Kelly, this is you 100%.
Yeah, I was looking at the question. I mean, so I wonder what the main concern is that fact that people are afraid that Christianity will die. And if Christianity dies in its current form, then I'm all for it. Because in its current form, it is not the beloved community. It has not embraced what I believe Christ calls us to be. It has been co-opted by the empire, and the church unfortunately has embraced what the empire is offering. And so I think really for me, the answer lies in how are we able to live authentic lives, both professionally, practically, spiritually, emotionally, and mentally. We can embrace both. And I also believe that every religious or spiritual tradition is valid and holds a place. The issue has been that Christianity has said they are the ones on center stage and have blocked anyone and everyone from actually expressing the fact that I embrace Christ Jesus or I embrace Christianity. And I also understand which Orisha rules my head or which Lawa walks with me. So I think that is really sort of the key. I don't think we should worry about so much about Christianity because in all aspects, the Creator doesn't care about what tradition we celebrate. It's all about the connection and the relationship that we have with the Creator, and that we can do it in so many beautiful ways. And the ways I believe for those of us who are different diasporas, or Native or Indigenous or Aboriginal, etc., is that we have this sort of extra because the world has turned away from us, seeing us as beloved and human and vital.
Thank you, Kwame. I would suggest that before we wrap up this activity, pay attention to the chat where there are other questions. But unfortunately, we're reaching the time that we have to end this activity, and I'd like to thank the panelists for their daring opportunity to say what they believe and they are committed to it, so that they might be able to steer and provoke more reactions as we continue our task of learning and witnessing to our teachings of faith. I particularly wanted to thank Francisco because I know that he has taken a lot of initiatives in this, the efforts to bring this panel together. And I, of course, like to thank all the panelists for doing their homework and providing all of us with some interesting and exciting food for thought as we move forward in our witness of faith. saying thank you again, and may the blessings of God be upon all of us.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.